This is a brand new phone. Selling it to you is actually the least profitable part of this business. And I'm going to show you exactly where the real money gets made once you're a paying customer for life. The place to start is inside the case, with the actual components sitting behind that screen. Analysts who take these phones apart piece by piece put the actual parts inside a recent flagship iPhone at around $485. That same model sold for $1,199, a gap on paper of roughly $714. But that number rarely tells the real story, because once you factor in everything it actually takes to design, build, ship, and sell a phone, research, marketing, assembly, logistics, warranty coverage, Apple's own reported hardware margin settles down to somewhere between 36 and 41%. Compare that against the other half of this business, services, App Store commissions, subscriptions, warranties, and one very specific deal with another tech giant we'll get into shortly, and that side of the business runs at close to a 76% margin, nearly double what hardware pulls in. That's the whole video in a single sentence, really. The phone gets you through the door. The actual business starts the moment you're inside it. None of this is unique to Apple either. Every major phone brand on the planet has built its own version of this trick, and a few of them are stranger than you'd expect. One of Apple's biggest rivals quietly makes more money selling Apple the parts to build this phone than it earns selling its own. Google hands Apple a payment large enough to move Alphabet's quarterly earnings just to stay the app you see first. And at the opposite end of the price spectrum, some of the biggest phone makers on Earth have publicly promised to basically stop chasing hardware profit altogether. We're going through every one of these, starting with what's inside the phone itself. What's actually inside it is where this story usually begins, and almost never where it ends. Analysts at TD Cowen put the production cost of a recent 256GB flagship iPhone, bill of materials plus packaging and assembly, at around $485, against a $1,199 retail price. The priciest single components weren't the glass or the metal, they were the display and the rear camera module, each estimated around $80, with the main processor chip trailing behind at roughly $45. TechInsights, running a separate teardown, valued that same processor closer to $91 once every layer of their analysis got counted. None of this is new either. Rewind all the way to the original iPhone, unveiled by Steve Jobs on January 9, 2007, a device he called a revolutionary and magical product that is literally 5 years ahead of any other mobile phone. iSupply's analysts tore that first model apart and estimated its components and manufacturing at $265.83 against a $599 retail price, a gap north of 55%. 20 years on, the model itself hasn't budged. What changed is everything stacked on top of it since. Apple, for the record, does not accept these numbers. Back in 2010, then Chief Financial Officer Peter Oppenheimer told investors, "Let me begin by suggesting that you don't put a lot of credence in these third-party reports that you see. It's always amazing to me the cost categories and the components that never seem to make it into the reports." Tim Cook has separately called these estimates nowhere near the truth, and honestly, they're onto something. Teardown numbers count parts and nothing else, leaving out research and development, software, marketing, and the labor of actually assembling the device. TechInsights analyst Wayne Lam has noted that assembly labor might run around $30 a phone in a Chinese factory, but could climb closer to $300 for the same phone built in the United States, adding that it's not even clear a competitively priced smartphone could get made there at all. Which raises the obvious question: if the hardware gap isn't the real profit story, what is? In fiscal year 2025, which wrapped on September 27, 2025, Apple posted total revenue of $416.16 billion, with the iPhone alone pulling in $209.59 billion, just over half of everything the company made that year. Sitting right beside that figure is services, App Store commissions, subscriptions, warranties, licensing, and it crossed $100 billion in annual revenue for the first time ever that same year, landing at $109.16 billion, up more than 13% from the year before. Here's the number that actually matters, though. Apple's reported gross margin on physical products, phones, laptops, watches, runs between roughly 36 and 41%, while its margin on services sits around 76%. Almost every dollar flowing in through services is worth close to double a dollar of hardware revenue. What I take from that is simple. The gap between what this phone cost to build and what you paid for it is the least interesting number in the whole story, because it was never really where Apple gets you. The real markup is invisible.
It's a services meter that starts running the second you power this thing on, and by the time you notice it, you've probably already been feeding it for years. That services engine runs entirely on scale. Apple counted around 2.5 billion active devices worldwide as of its most recent reported quarter, each one a potential customer for something that isn't the phone itself. The App Store alone reported around 850 million weekly users in 2025, and Apple states developers have earned more than $550 billion through the platform since launch. Apple has also claimed the App Store facilitated $1.4 trillion in total sales and billings in 2025, though that particular figure comes from a study Apple commissioned itself, worth keeping in mind. However you slice it, this stopped being a company that needs you to buy a phone once. It needs you to stay. And that's really the whole shift, distilled into one idea. Apple isn't a phone company that happens to sell services on the side anymore, in my view. It's closer to a subscription business that ships a phone first, because that phone is what gets you inside the walls in the first place. Here's the strange part. The longer you hold on to that phone, the better this arrangement works for them, not worse. Assurance trade-in and upgrade data shows the average phone people trade in has crept noticeably older, with the overall replacement cycle reaching 3.84 years across the first 3 quarters of 2025. On paper, that should terrify a hardware company, fewer new phones moving. But if the real business lives in what happens after the sale, a customer holding onto their phone for 4 years just handed over 4 years of App Store commissions, subscriptions, and services revenue instead of 4 years of missed upgrades. If you're finding this kind of breakdown useful, now's a solid moment to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps a channel like this reach more people, and there's plenty more coming. Back to how strange this industry gets once you look past the biggest name in it. Apple isn't the only one running an unusual version of this game, not by a long shot. Take Samsung. Most people picture it as Apple's biggest rival, and it is, but it's also one of Apple's suppliers. Samsung Display has built the OLED screens for Apple's Pro model iPhones since the iPhone X launched in 2017. And Samsung Semiconductor sells memory chips to Apple, Google, and Xiaomi alike, competitors all. The Wall Street Journal reported Samsung sold Apple somewhere between 180 and 200 million OLED panels for that one iPhone X model alone, and actually earned more from supplying that single Apple phone than from its own flagship, the Galaxy S8, that same year. Samsung's phone division, officially named Mobile Experience, has run margins around 10% in recent reporting. Solid enough, but nowhere near what its chip division pulls in. During a sharp memory chip price boom in the first quarter of 2026, chips accounted for roughly 94% of Samsung's entire operating profit. An unusually extreme quarter, sure, but a real one, and a clear signal of where this company actually earns its money. That's genuinely clarifying, and here's my take on it directly. When the #1 phone maker on Earth would rather get paid for the parts than for the finished phone, that tells you everything about how brutal the hardware side of this business really is. Being a supplier turns out to be safer than being a brand. Then there's a deal most iPhone owners have never even heard of:
arguably one of the strangest revenue lines in all of tech. Alphabet, Google's parent company, reportedly paid Apple around $20 billion in 2022 simply to stay the default search engine inside Safari, a figure that surfaced through unsealed documents in a Department of Justice antitrust case. That single payment amounts to roughly 20% of Apple's entire services revenue in 1 year, for essentially doing nothing but leaving a default setting untouched. From Google's side, factor in every default placement deal it holds, not just Apple's, and that spending works out to roughly a quarter of Alphabet's total operating income. This might be the single most underrated line item in the whole smartphone industry, honestly. Apple earns an amount of money large enough to matter to Alphabet's own earnings, for a payment that costs Apple almost nothing to collect. At those kinds of margins, it's about as close to free money as a business this size can get. That arrangement is currently sitting under real pressure, though. Federal Judge Amit Mehta ruled in August of 2024 that Google had illegally monopolized the search market, and the future of default placement deals like the one with Apple now hangs inside that unresolved case. If the arrangement changes, the fallout doesn't stop at Google. It strips away a genuinely enormous, almost pure profit slice of Apple's services revenue overnight.
Now flip to the completely opposite end of this industry, because not every phone brand is chasing the premium game. Xiaomi's founder and CEO, Lei Jun, made an actual public promise on April 25, 2018. If the margin crosses 5%, then we will find a way to return the excess above 5% to our users. Xiaomi has built its business around that promise ever since, pricing hardware close to cost and making its real money through what it calls internet services, apps, ads, and subscriptions layered on top of its devices. Its most recent annual results, covering fiscal 2025, show that Internet Services Division running at a 76.5% gross margin, nearly matching Apple's services margin, while its actual smartphone hardware margin slid from 12.6% the year before down to 10.9%, and dropped as low as 8.3% in the final quarter, largely thanks to rising memory chip costs. Xiaomi's president, Lu Weibing, called that memory inflation a huge challenge. Then there's a brand most people in the West have barely heard of, Transsion, owner of the Tecno, Infinix, and itel brands, which dominates the ultra-affordable end of the market. Research firm Omdia reported that in the first quarter of 2026, Transsion held 47% of the entire African smartphone market, shipping more than double the units of its nearest competitor, Samsung. Transsion isn't betting on you paying a premium for a $1,000 phone. It's built an entire services layer on top of devices costing a fraction of that. Its own music streaming app, its own payments platform, its own after-sales repair network, monetizing people who were never going to buy a flagship in the first place. Which brings me to a closing opinion that ties every one of these companies together, from Apple all the way down to Transsion. I don't think phones keep getting more expensive because they cost more to build. I think every one of these brands, at every price point, landed on the exact same trick, that the phone stopped being the product a long time ago. It's the toll booth for everything you do afterward, and Apple just built the most expensive, most profitable version of that toll booth in the world. That toll booth is currently facing more legal and regulatory pressure than at any point in its history. Apple's fight with Epic Games over its App Store commission, standard at 30%, reduced to 15% for smaller developers under a program that began January 1, 2021, ended with Apple winning most of the original case, but losing on the specific question of steering customers toward outside payment options. Federal Judge Yvonne Gonzalez Rogers found Apple in civil contempt over how it handled that ruling in May of 2025, calling the company's conduct gross insubordination and stating Apple had aimed to preserve a revenue stream valued in the billions, directly defying this court's injunction. An appeals court upheld that contempt finding in December of 2025, and the case is now headed toward the Supreme Court. Regulators in Europe fined Apple 500 million euros in April of 2025 under the Digital Markets Act over restrictions on developers directing users to outside payment options, a fine Apple is currently appealing. On top of all that, right-to-repair laws are chipping away at yet another piece of this business, with states including New York, effective December 2023, and California, effective July 2024, now legally requiring manufacturers to make parts and repair information more accessible, pushing directly back against practices that made repairs harder and, by extension, made buying a brand new phone the path of least resistance. Back to where we started then. This is a brand new phone. Selling it to you was never really the point. The parts inside cost a few $100s. The company that made it earns a modest margin on that hardware. And from there, if everything about this business model runs the way it's designed to, it keeps earning from you in ways you'll barely notice. Every subscription, every app purchase, every default setting left untouched. Every extra year you keep using it instead of upgrading. Apple built the most profitable version of that system anywhere in the world. Samsung figured out it's safer to sell the parts than to sell the phone. Xiaomi and Transsion walked away from the hardware margin almost entirely and built whole businesses on what comes after. And right now, courts and regulators on 2 continents are actively deciding just how much of that system these companies get to keep. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one. And if you're curious how coffee brands actually make their billions, that video's right here. Go watch it.